Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Political State Podcast from the Oklahoman. I'm Ben Felder here in the Oklahoman's podcast studio in our downtown newsroom. Joining me in the studio is the Oklahoman's federal government reporter, Chris Castile. Chris, happy 4th of July.
And thanks, Ben. You too.
Yeah.
Congresswoman.
Yeah, a day before. And our guest this week, Representative Kendra Horn of Oklahoma's 5th Congressional District. Congresswoman, thanks so much for your time. Welcome.
Glad to be here.
Well, you are a little more than half a year into your first term, a 2-year term, so it's kind of almost the end of your first quarter. So if it's a football game, you'd be at the end of your first quarter.
That's true.
I'm curious, how would you judge your performance so far in the first quarter?
Well, I think we have played really hard since the very beginning. We've had some good accomplishments, and we've got a lot more to go. You can't give up after the first quarter. It's just getting started, but I think the very first part of the first quarter was an interesting challenge to walk into, and I think it's going to be a very interesting second quarter all the way through.
That first part they're talking about was the government.
shutdown.
You walked right into a government shutdown.
Yeah. I mean, somebody asked me about that early on in the very first week or so, what it was like to walk into the middle of a government shutdown, and I said, I've never been a freshman in Congress before, but I'm pretty sure this is unusual. And in fact it was, but I am pleased with the way that we were able to reach out and highlight the importance of facilities like the Monroney Center here and the importance of the Air Traffic Controller Training Center and what that means to our nation's air travel and safety and the contribution that Oklahoma City makes and the importance of really re-examining how we make decisions, because it just, to me, is fundamentally wrong that regardless of which side does it, that we would even consider it an option to shut down the government and put that burden on the backs of the people that are working for us in so many ways, whether it's food safety or air traffic safety or other things like that, and not have the people that are making the decisions be the ones that bear that responsibility.
And the employees, I think you pointed this out. You have the FAA in your district. They all were made whole eventually, but all those contractors were not.
Yep, absolutely, and that's something I co-sponsor several pieces of legislation to address that. And the good news is that in the current appropriations bills, as we pass them out of the House, there are some provisions in there that will make those contractors whole. And it's especially important, and I think a lot of people, if they haven't worked as a government contractor, don't know that they don't get the benefits and they didn't get the back pay. And for many people, those were not high paid contractors. It was hourly wage workers, janitors, and food service. And that to me is even more important. They didn't do anything to deserve being let go from their jobs. They were doing their jobs. And so it is our job, I think, to make them whole.
Such an interesting time to come into Congress. You talk about, coming in with a shutdown. It's such a, Chris, you could be a judge of this. I mean, Congress is always dramatic, I suppose, but just seems even more so, these days. Not a great chance to just ease into it, right? I mean, you've really had to just kind of, get up to speed and hit the ground running pretty quick, right?
Absolutely. It's just like taking a leap and diving in, and you just got to swim. But, I think that your point is really interesting, because there's always a lot of back and forth and adjustment when there's a new group of people. There were more than 100 new members that came in, a new majority. But the interesting thing, I think, the way that our media gets consumed, especially on the national level and on the social media level, it appears even more that people are pushed to their corners. But what I have experienced in coming in with this new class is that there are a whole lot more of us that are closer to the center. We're from places like Oklahoma, where we ran because we wanted to help our communities. We really are focused on serving our communities, and whether that is through rural broadband access or protecting our air traffic controllers or addressing housing issues at Tinker, all of these things, we're very focused on that. But the fascination and a lot of the coverage centers on just a few people on either end. And we don't see as much from those of us who are just rolling up our sleeves and doing the work in the middle, especially at the national level. I think locally it's been different. But we've got to keep talking about that because that's where the real work gets done.
Yeah, and you wound up, I mean, there's so much attention being paid to, kind of the push by Democrats who took over the House in January, on Trump and, possible impeachment and all the subpoenas that have been issued. But you wound up on a couple of committees that have absolutely nothing to do with that, a couple that are very actually bipartisan. The Armed Services Committee has always been kind of a bipartisan committee, or the bill that you guys produced a couple of weeks ago is a bipartisan bill for the most part. Yep. Space Science Committee is there's not really any kind of partisan split there. So you're really kind of remote from some of those issues. Probably a lot of times the only exposure you have to them is when the media asks you questions about it because you've been doing other things all day.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point. And I'm very pleased with the committee assignments that I got. They were two that were important to me that I, requested. One, because the Armed Services Committee does such important work, not only for our communities, but for our national security. And it was my experience over and over again that we would show up in committee hearings and, if you put a blindfold on, especially when we're dealing with issues like housing, you wouldn't have known if it was a Republican or a Democrat asking that question because it was about what's the best interest of our service members. And I think we need to keep lifting that up because there's a lot of work that's being done in committees like the committees I sit on, and a lot of important issues that we're addressing that just don't get the attention because they're not quite as explosive or controversial, if you will, but they're so important to the functioning of our communities, to our nation's security, to so many other different things that impact our lives on a day-to-day basis.
Right.
Well, you talked about the habit of pushing people into those corners. So let's unpack that a little bit. I mean, so you just started your first term, it feels like, but you're already, in the nature of the House, you're always up for re-election. You've got two already Republican challengers. They're going to have to go through a primary. But already early, you're trying to kind of paint you into that corner. I've talked about you being, very extremist to the left and maybe comparing you to, some of those coastal Democrats. Where would you place yourself on that political spectrum? You've used the word moderate, but where would you place yourself on there?
I'd place myself much closer to the center. I'm not going to run away from being a Democrat, but I didn't run to just represent Democrats. I'm here to serve all the people of Oklahoma in the 5th Congressional District. And the lens, I think anybody that knows me or has had the opportunity to talk to me knows the lens I'm going to make decisions through is factual. It's what's in the best interest of the community. And sometimes that puts me at cross purposes with people in my own party and sometimes with the other party. But to me, the bottom line when I'm making decisions is it smart? Does it help us get where we need to go? And is it good for our communities? And that's how I'm always going to make decisions. And at the same time, I have an open door policy. I meet with, anybody that comes in. I meet with industry, advocacy groups, individuals, because I think it's our job to take in as much information as possible and try to craft those policies. So that's where I would place myself, and I understand people are going to try to paint me into certain corners, but that's not who I am, and I'm not going to fire back in the opposite direction, and I just want to stay focused on helping the people of the 5th District.
Yeah.
Let me ask you just interject on this because we're going to get into kind of the border situation and what's going to happen at Fort Sill. But last week when the House and Senate were trying to get the border aid bill passed, and the Senate passed a version, had a bipartisan version. The House version had been split along party lines. There were apparently a lot of centrist Democrats who told the Speaker, let's just take the Senate bill, get this done. Were you among them?
I was.
Okay.
I was.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And here's my thinking on this. Right now we have a humanitarian crisis. I think that's indisputable. And the conditions that we've seen many people being held in as the United States, if we want to continue to envision ourselves as that city on the hill or the example, that we have a responsibility to treat people with decency and humanity regardless, and that goes across the board. And for me, the question was not, is there a problem here, and do we need more oversight to ensure that these problems are addressed? Because we absolutely do. But bottom line is, we've got to my sentiment is we got to get the funding to get these children beds and blankets and toothbrushes and showers, and I just look at everything through this lens of I don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the possible, and wanting to make sure that we got the funding to address this situation immediately, and then we can continue to make sure that these problems are addressed, and we can step forward and look towards a more comprehensive immigration solution, which we need. But it doesn't mean that we're going to just give the money and then step back and not make sure that it's being used for the reasons it was supposed to be used. It meant that we got to take care of these people, and I don't want them to have to wait any longer. And it's like emergency funding. When we passed that emergency funding bill for all of the major earthquakes, tornadoes, floods, all of that, we need to help people where we can right now, and waiting to me doesn't help those kids, and that's where I came down on it.
Are you thinking about going down there? Have you gone down there to kind of assess it yourself? You know, there were some of your colleagues were down there this week who talked about just how appalling the conditions were.
I haven't been down there yet, but some of my colleagues are working on a bipartisan trip down there,
okay.
and we're working on getting down there to be able to see. But I think being a part of a bipartisan trip is also really important to me. A lot of the legislation that I've worked on so far and will continue to work on is bipartisan. And I think having that full view, to me, this isn't a partisan issue. This is about how we treat people and where our systems need to be fixed and what we've got to address with this crisis.
So do you think about, I mean, you talk about kind of, and I'm going to use the word optics, and I don't mean that in a negative term, but I mean, for you who is a moderate, and you're trying to appeal to Republicans in your district, you mean you have to win some of them over, and you did. I mean, do you feel like you have to give consideration to some of these issues? Like, I don't want to immediately jump into something that's going to be that's going to appear that I'm just going extreme to the left, that's going to tune out those who are more moderate or are to the right. I mean, how much of a thought process do you go through in thinking, hey, I should do it in a bipartisan way, as opposed to maybe going down with maybe some of the more extreme members? How much is that part of your thought process?
That's not really the lens as much as, for me, the way I look at things is what is the right thing to do, and what gets us furthest, the fastest in the right way. Mm-hmm. So my question is always, okay, what's the problem and what's the end goal? Versus, I think sometimes when we get caught up in partisan games, it is how I want to get someplace versus what the end goal is, and that's the lens that I like to look at it through. Okay, what's our problem? What's the outcome that we want to seek, and what's a pathway that's going to get us there? And I just personally think that it's good to reach out to different people, mm-hmm. to build friendships, to build relationships. I always have, and bringing people together, we end up having a whole lot more in common than we have different. But we have to look for those things, because it's really easy to notice the difference. So one of those things is not like the other, except 80% of the rest of it is. And so that's where I always try to look at it. What's the problem, and what's the desired outcome, and how can we get there and do it in the smartest way possible?
Yeah. Well, let's talk about your energy votes in that context. I mean, there was a series of votes on the interior spending bill about opening actually it's about blocking exploration off Atlantic, Pacific, ANWR, Eastern Gulf, and then there was a methane rule. Every Oklahoman member of Congress, for as long as I can remember, would have voted the opposite way that you did. And there would seem to be some kind of larger question there, rather than just specifically what about drilling off the coast of Virginia, what about ANWR. Kind of a larger issue you must have confronted here, having such a huge energy industry presence in your district, about how you're going to approach these votes.
There's a lot of considerations that went in, and the way that I look at everything, we spent time researching the amendments, looking at what was in there, reaching out to industry to solicit input, but also looking at the environmental impacts, looking at the other stakeholders that came in to those questions, and just specifically on the offshore. As a member of the Armed Services Committee, the DoD has expressed concerns about the impact of their training exercises and a number of other things, and the impact on our national security.
Well, that's in the Eastern
additional
Gulf, which has been closed off to most drilling, I think, for a long time, though, right?
Well, they're also concerned about additional drilling and other places.
The
Yeah.
naval presence.
Yeah, and then there are also 13 governors, both parties, who have expressed concern about it. So
I was going to ask you about that because there's a lot of NIMBY when it comes to energy production. Not in my backyard. And that could go for wind turbines off Cape Cod, oil rigs off Santa Barbara, whatever it might be. But there doesn't seem to be that kind of concern from Congress about Oklahoma and Texas. There's, hey, they're doing it there. Let's let them drill those things in Oklahoma and Texas. Don't put them in ANWR. Don't put them in the Atlantic.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. But there's also the challenge that I've found of educating my colleagues, especially some of the colleagues on the left, about the importance of our industry here and the impact that it has. And particularly, we know that natural gas has been a key factor in reducing the amount of greenhouse gas emissions. Take the Oklahoma City area in the 5th District alone, and OG&E has, over the last decade or so, shifted a good chunk of their power plants from coal-fired to natural gas, and had a substantial decrease in greenhouse gas emissions, 24% in decrease in greenhouse gas emissions just from that shift. So that again goes back to that lens that I look at everything through. It's not an all or nothing consideration, but what gets us there, what helps to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, because if we wait to switch everything over all at once, well, that doesn't get us there. We still have all of our power and energy, or most of it is based off of that. So how can we reduce greenhouse gas emissions and still ensure that that our industry is able to continue, that we keep jobs, and that we have a full suite of options? It's not just one or the other, but that's always the calculus that I'm looking at.
I'm kind of wondering how they react to that, given that the national perception about fracking, and in fact, one of your Democratic predecessors, Dan Boren, was one of the politicians who was kind of skewered in that movie Gasland about natural gas drilling. So do you get kind of blowback from your colleagues about fracking when you try to sell them on natural gas?
I think that goes to the overall balance of how do we fix things. We started to see that here in Oklahoma. We absolutely had to adjust the way that drilling was happening to, and it was the reinjection, and ensure that we were not creating more seismic instability, and learning from the science and following it. And sometimes that means adjustments by industry. Sometimes that means a lot of different things. But it's not an all or nothing. For me, it's never an all or nothing. It's not an anti or a pro. It's a what's the right decision to balance our economic interest and our environmental interest, and putting on my hat on the Science, Space, and Technology Committee. I'm also on the Energy Subcommittee. So we've spent time in hearings on the Energy Subcommittee talking about how we reduce greenhouse gas emissions and protect jobs and move to the next generation of investment. And that takes time, it takes intention, and it takes thoughtfulness. And that means, I think, sometimes saying yes to this and no to that, and going through all of the details and making the best decisions we possibly can. And, drilling in Oklahoma is different than drilling off the coast. And we have to take all of those factors into account. So I'm always troubled by a blanket idea that I'm going to always agree with one group or person every single time, or disagree every single time, because that, I think, gives us, we end up in these blind spots. We might make poor decisions just because we've already written a group off. And the commitment that I've made to anybody that's ever come in to my office and anybody I meet with is that we have an open door policy. We're going to reach out. We're going to have conversations. I want the facts. We're going to lay it all out and be honest about where we are, and see where we can work together and where we can find the best solution. But that goes to that point of compromise and consensus, which seem to me too often dirty words, I think.
Yeah. So we're taping this on July 3rd. Tomorrow's the 4th. It doesn't sound like you're rushing off for President Trump's big 4th of July parade tomorrow.
I'm going to be in the Bethany.
Okay.
Yeah, we're going to be in Bethany. It's one of my favorite parades.
So you won't be at the parade in D.C., but I'm curious, what is your opinion of getting a lot of attention, the use of military equipment in D.C., this kind of, parade that you might find more common in a place like Red Square? What's kind of your take on the president's?
Well, no, I'm going to be here in Oklahoma, but I think the celebration of the nation's founding, the 4th of July celebration, has always been about everyone coming together, being nonpartisan, bringing us together to remind us about the ideals that we were established on. Now, it doesn't mean we've always done everything right, but the ideals about bringing people together and bringing them in, and it's not just about military. I am a proud member of the Armed Services Committee, and I take that job very seriously, and that means that we have to take care of our readiness. It means that we have to take care of our troops and find the right balance. But it also means that as a country that was brought together under democratic ideals, a democratic republic that brings everybody's voices to the table, we also need to celebrate and value diplomacy and the one vote, one voice, the ability of every single person in our community, or what we should strive towards, to make sure their voice is heard. And there are many ways to show strength that are not all about that. And when we need that, then we can be out into the world to protect ourselves and our allies.
By that, do you mean armored vehicles?
Yeah, and like this 4th of July should be a reminder about the Declaration of Independence, and that the founding fathers and mothers and people who were not ever heard, we don't know about necessarily, or we should, we're moving toward that idea that all of our voices matter, and it's not all about that. So I would hope that we would be more inclusive and be more thoughtful about it, and not just rely on demonstrate. We know we have military prowess in the world, but we don't need to show it off all the time, I think.
Yeah. Well, just a few minutes left here in this episode. I want to ask you, so, we mentioned, you're in the House, always running for the next election, it seems. Really strong fundraising first quarter for you, and the second quarter numbers will come up here pretty soon. Are you expecting that to be strong, and just kind of, what do you attribute that to? I mean, you go from having one of the biggest upsets of 2018, now you're an incumbent, and that comes with a certain amount of strength, and not to say by any means that holding onto the seat will be easy, but it seems like you've got some momentum, at least in the fundraising. I mean, how would you kind of assess your chances as you move closer to 2020?
Absolutely. I think we're going to show some very strong numbers next week, but what that shows to me, and I think what you're going to see through that, is there are thousands of Oklahomans who have supported us in the first quarter and the second quarter and moving forward. And I think that upset that you talked about really showed that it wasn't about, and this was never about me, it was all about we. And there are a lot of Oklahomans who invested their time and their money and their belief that they want to have a part in the process. And I think that's what it shows, because we took the no corporate PAC pledge. So all of the money we raised is from individuals or, some associations. And I think that is very important, because it's the voices of the people. And I think what it says is that we've got people of all different backgrounds and political persuasions, and it's Oklahomans doing what they can. I've got, people that do $5 a month, and, people that do more, but it's about their voices in the process. And I think I'm very proud of that, and that's something that I always put at the front and center, whether it's on the official side or when we're talking about the campaign, because the more people we hear from, I think the better decisions we make. And so I'm feeling good about it, and we'll have some numbers to reveal next week. But the bottom line is that Oklahomans continue to step up.
Yeah.
I just had a quick follow
Sure.
on the border stuff in Fort Sill. There were demonstrations at Senator Langford's office today, and at Representative Cole's office yesterday. Not all about Fort Sill, but there were some specifically about Fort Sill. The speaker sent the president a letter yesterday saying that children shouldn't stay more than 90 days in these influx camps. What's your in influx facilities? I'm sorry. What's your take on that? I mean, do you feel like Fort Sill is an appropriate place for some of them to go, and how long should they stay?
I think the 90 days is a sufficient amount of time to make that transition, and the at Fort Sill, as you know, sadly we saw an influx in 2014. So this has happened before. It would be transferring these children from the Customs and Border Patrol to the HHS, and ensuring that then they can get placed properly. And I think I'm really troubled by the conditions. I mean, we've clearly covered that, and we've got to make sure that there is oversight and there is transparency. I think that is important in everything. Mm-hmm. Everything we do as a government, we should be transparent. There should be the ability to oversee all of this. And while I don't love the idea of having so many children in these sort of situations, we've got to be able to safely transition them and make sure that they're not just getting held, and that they're being treated with dignity and respect, that they have that they have people that are advocating for them, because these are children that we're talking about. And I think that's the next step is figuring out how we get people out of these facilities and get them where they need to be.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, that's going to do it for our time today. But Congresswoman, thanks so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Good to be
so
here
much
with both of you.
in.
Happy
Yeah.
4th.
Yeah. Well, you enjoy that parade in Bethany tomorrow.
Thanks. I
Yeah.
will.
Well, that's going to do it for this week's episode of the Political State Podcast from the Oklahoman. You can find this and every other episode on your favorite podcasting app, also on the Oklahoman's YouTube page. With Chris Castillo and Ben Felder, thanks for joining us. We'll see you again next week.